Hi, I'm Izzy, and this is Dizzy Quilts and Sews. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I prepare and cut my fabric ready for a quilt project. Alright, so before we go to the cutting table and I show you how I cut yardage, fat quarters, or scraps, the first thing I want to do is talk about prepping your fabric. So there's a lot of disagreement, theories on whether or not you should pre-wash quilting fabric or quilting cotton. Now, I am firmly in the camp of no pre-washing my quilting fabric because once the quilt is finished, I love to throw it in the washer and dryer and get the nice crinkly effect that you get as your backing and top fabrics shrink a tiny little bit with the batting. I just love that. But if you prefer a look where after a wash nothing happens, it's still as flat as it was, then you can pre-wash your fabric. I would suggest you pre-wash everything. So don't have fabric in your top that's been pre-washed alongside fabric in your top that's not been pre-washed, because then things are going to shrink at a different rate, and then you run the danger of things getting out of, like getting twisted or pulling even. I've seen seams come apart in that case. So if you are going to pre-wash everything. If you're not, then pre-wash nothing. Know that I've been making quilts for about 15 years now. I've never pre-washed my fabric, and I have yet to run into an issue with colors running, things shrinking at different rates or differently. It's all been good. So I do use 100% cotton fabric for both the top and the back all of the time. And my batting is a blend, so I think it's 80% cotton, 20% polyester, and it's very thin. And I've never ever run into any problems. So I don't pre-wash. Step number 2 is to press your fabric. Whether you're using yardage, fat quarters, fat eighths, or scraps, you need a flat piece of fabric before you start quilting, before you start cutting. So bring your fabric to your ironing station, press it flat. Make sure that your selvage, if you've got yardage, your selvages, the ends are about even, and press everything flat. Once you've got your fabric all nice and flat, you can take it to the cutting table, and I will show you how I cut my fabric. All right, so I've got yardage here. So this is about half a yard. I have a fold up here, and I have the selvage down here. I've pressed this piece as good as I can. I mean, there's still slight folds in here, but it's pretty flat. So that was the first thing I did. And next, although this looks very straight, and like the store I bought this from did an amazing job, there aren't super ragged edges or anything, I'm still going to start by cutting a clean edge on this side. So what I do is I take my long 6 by 24 inch ruler, and I'm going to line one of the lines on my ruler with the selvage at the bottom, because we know the selvage is on grain. So I'm going to line up my ruler with the selvage here, and then cut off a tiny sliver of fabric. It's not much, but now I've got a super clean edge to work with, and I know that this is on grain. So I'm not going to get any funny twisting or stretching or anything like that. Now, if I needed to cut a big square or strip out of this, so wider than my ruler is 6 inches. If I needed to cut, for example, a 8-inch strip of fabric, I would line my fabric up with one of the lines on my cutting mat, line it up this way, and then measure 8 inches. Put my ruler, lining it up with the grid, and then chop off the strip that way. Now, if I have strips that are narrower than my ruler, what I do is I'm going to flip this over so my clean edge is now on this side. And I'm just going to ignore the lines on my mat and just use my ruler. So in the quilt I'm making now, I need 5.5 and 5 3/4 inch squares. The first cut I'm going to make is always the biggest cut. So I know I need 5 3/4 inch squares. So that's the first one I'm going to do. So I'm going to line up 5 3/4 with the lines on my ruler right here. And once I'm nice and even, I'm just going to cut the strip. Notice how my hand is always on the ruler. Be careful that your fingers don't get in the way of your rotary cutter, obviously. And then if you have a nice sharp blade, it's just going to cut through the fabric like butter. If you start struggling and needing to go over your fabric 2-3 times, it's time to change your blade. By the way, when you put this down on your table, I don't care if it's for a second, always close it. So now I've got a nice 5 3/4 inch strip from which I'm going to cut 5 3/4 inch squares. The next size is going to be 5.5. So I'm going to cut my 5.5 strip. Once again, I'm lining up on the left and cutting like this. There you go. So now I've cut my strips. I need squares. So I'm going to set this aside. And I'm going to start with the larger squares first. Now what I need to do, the first step is to cut off the selvage. And you can see on this fabric, the selvage is quite wide. So I need to get rid of all of that. Now, I can use my 6 by 24 inch ruler for this as well. It'll work just fine. So I'm going to line up my ruler, one of the lines here, with the clean edge of this strip, and take off the selvage. And now I need 5 3/4 squares so I can turn this around and again have the fabric I'm cutting or the good pieces under my ruler. So in this pattern it says I need 4 5 3/4 inch squares. So using my ruler, I'm not using the grids on my mat at all here. I'm just using my ruler. I'm cutting 2. Remember, this is folded, so I have 2 pieces here. And then again, lining up 2 more. So I've got my 4. So these are done. I can set them to the side. Now I've got this leftover piece here that's 5 3/4 inch wide, and I need 5.5 squares. Now I could use my 5.5 strip here, but to save on fabric, what I can do is simply remove a 1/4 inch from this leftover piece here and cut a couple squares from this. So I'm going to do that. There you go. 1/4 inch gone. Now I'm left with 5.5 strips, and I need 8 of these. So I can cut 2 out of this remaining piece right here. There's 2. I could cut an extra one out of this, but I don't usually like to use the one with the fold here. I mean, you totally can, just press it flat, but I'm going to keep this as a scrap to use in some other block. And I'm going to pull over my 5.5 inch strip here, cut off the selvage. Take off my selvage. flip it around so the fabric or the good piece is always under my ruler. And then I'm going to measure my 5.5 inch squares. There's 2 more, so that's 4. 6. And take your time here. A rotary cutter is extremely sharp, and believe me, it hurts if you catch a finger. And there you go. So I have my 8, 5.5. I've got my 4, 5 3/4. And these 2 bits I can set to the side for now and use them either in a later project or as needed in other blocks. So that is how you would cut yardage of fabric. All right. The method is exactly the same if you're cutting a fat 1/8 or a fat 1/4 of fabric. This is a fat 8. It's 9 inches long, wide by half the width of the fabric, so usually around 21 inches. You'll notice that at the bottom I still have the selvage. I'd say, I don't think I've ever seen a fat 1/4 or a fat 1/8 without the selvage at one end. So you can base yourself on this when cutting off one side to get a very clean edge. So same thing we did before. I'm going to line up my ruler with the selvage and cut off a sliver of fabric to make sure that I've got a nice, clean, straight, on-grain edge to work with, and then cut my fabric exactly as we did for the yardage. So that's for a fat 8 or a fat 1/4. If you're using scraps to put together your quilt, you're most likely not going to have a selvage to base yourself off of to get a nice, clean, on-grain cut. There are a number of different techniques you can do to find the grain. You can pull a thread, you can rip it and tear it, because when you cut and then tear fabric, it's always on grain, and then just clean that edge and you're good to go. I usually don't worry about it so much with scraps, unless I'm going to be cutting like large-ish pieces that might get distorted, then I don't worry about it. So I wouldn't get too hung up on it if you're making scrap quilts. Just make sure your scraps are very flat, so you've pressed them flat. And then again though, that does not change. You start with a clean edge to get as much accuracy as you can. And if the fabric is printed properly, you might be able to actually follow the print to get a nice on-grain line. So again, take a sliver off, very little. You've got a nice clean edge here, and you can start cutting your pieces from this. So that's how I go about cutting yardage, fat 1/4s or fat 1/8s, and my scraps. And there you have it. So now you are ready to start making a quilt. So cutting is really not complicated once you know the basic guidelines. I don't want to call them rules. There are no rules as far as I'm concerned. You do what works for you. But if you start with nice flat fabric and then follow some basic guidelines in terms of cutting, then things will just be that much easier. If you have any questions about what I showed you today, please leave those in the comments below. My email address is also in the description box below, so if you want to have a more one-on-one type conversation, please never hesitate. Send me an email. I try to respond to those as quickly as I can. Thank you so much for watching today. Please give the video a like if you liked it, and consider subscribing to the channel, especially if you like this kind of content. If you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, you'll know as soon as one more of these videos comes out. Thanks again, and I will see you soon.